You're listening to the Bare Metal Cyber Prepcast, created to help you succeed in your educational journey. Learn more at baremetalcyber.com, where additional prepcasts, books, and training materials await. Let's get started. The Agile mindset is best understood as a values-driven orientation, a way of thinking that prioritizes customer value, adaptability, and learning over rigid adherence to plans. It is not simply a set of practices, but a philosophy that guides how teams respond to change and uncertainty. For example, rather than resisting shifting requirements as a disruption, Agile practitioners see them as opportunities to refine value delivery. This mindset encourages curiosity, resilience, and openness to feedback. It is what allows teams to thrive in dynamic environments where predictability is limited. By emphasizing adaptability and learning, the Agile mindset shifts focus away from protocol compliance and toward outcomes that matter to stakeholders. For exam purposes, candidates who internalize this concept will recognize why many scenario-based questions test not just what a team should do, but why that action aligns with Agile values. Underlying the mindset are the values and principles articulated in frameworks like the Agile Manifesto. Values such as individuals and interactions over processes and tools, and working software over comprehensive documentation, provide high-level priorities. Principles extend these ideas into specific guidance for collaboration, cadence, and quality. For instance, the principle of delivering working increments frequently underscores the importance of feedback loops, while the principle of welcoming changing requirements highlights adaptability. These values and principles act as the compass for decision-making when trade-offs are required. Should a team prioritize speed or completeness? Should stakeholders be consulted now or later? By referring back to values and principles, practitioners can make consistent, defensible choices. For exam candidates, familiarity with these foundations helps navigate questions where multiple answers may seem plausible, but only one aligns with core Agile philosophy. Empiricism is central to Agile practice, representing a learn-by-doing philosophy that relies on transparency, inspection, and adaptation. It assumes that teams cannot predict everything up front and must instead make decisions based on evidence gathered during work. This evidence can come from metrics like velocity or throughput, feedback from stakeholders, or outcomes observed in delivered increments. By working empirically, teams avoid guesswork and reduce risk through ongoing validation. An analogy is cooking. Rather than following a rigid recipe blindly, an empiricist tastes along the way, adjusting seasoning as needed. The exam frequently embeds empiricism into scenarios, asking candidates to choose approaches that emphasize real data over assumptions. Understanding empiricism means recognizing that Agile is not about controlling variables, but about embracing uncertainty with structured learning cycles. Transparency supports empiricism by ensuring that information about work, risks, and progress is visible to all stakeholders. Without transparency, inspection is meaningless because there is nothing to examine. Teams promote transparency through artifacts like product backlogs, task boards, and burn-down charts. They also use ceremonies such as sprint reviews to expose progress openly. Transparency requires more than tools, however. It demands honesty and courage. Teams must be willing to surface blockers, acknowledge risks, and admit mistakes. For example, showing unfinished work in a demo may feel uncomfortable, but it enables constructive feedback. On the exam, transparency often appears in scenarios where hidden information has created misalignment or delay. The correct response usually involves making work visible, so that informed, collective decisions can be made in time to matter. Inspection is the deliberate examination of work and processes at defined intervals. Time-box ceremonies like sprint reviews or retrospectives are built around this principle. The purpose is not to criticize, but to detect variance early, when adjustments are cheaper and easier. For instance, inspecting progress halfway through a sprint allows a team to address obstacles before they derail delivery. Inspection works best when paired with transparency. There must be something visible to examine, and with adaptation, teams must act on what they discover. Without inspection, projects drift. Without adaptation, inspection becomes empty ritual. Exam questions often frame inspection in terms of cadence or timing, such as whether a team should review progress daily or only at the end of a release. Recognizing inspection as a proactive, regular discipline helps identify answers that reflect Agile's emphasis on learning through cycles. Adaptation naturally follows inspection, representing the willingness to change plans, scope, or process based on evidence. In Agile, adaptation is not a sign of failure, but of responsiveness. If a backlog item is no longer valuable, it should be dropped. If a process hinders flow, it should be modified. Adaptation requires humility, as teams must admit that initial assumptions were imperfect. It also requires courage, as changing course often challenges existing commitments. For example, a team that discovers a critical usability flaw mid-sprint may adapt by reprioritizing work, even if it disrupts plans. The exam frequently tests this concept through questions about trade-offs. When should a team stick to the plan, and when should it pivot? Candidates who internalize adaptation understand that agility prioritizes outcomes over predictability, valuing responsiveness to real-world signals. The growth mindset, a concept from educational psychology, plays a key role in agile contexts. It is the belief that abilities are not fixed but can be developed through effort, feedback, and practice. Teams with a growth mindset approach challenges as opportunities rather than threats. Failure becomes data, not defeat. For instance, if a release underperforms, a growth-oriented team studies the outcome, adjusts practices, and improves. This mindset fuels innovation and resilience, as individuals are less afraid to experiment or admit gaps. On the exam, growth mindset scenarios often involve questions about how leaders respond to setbacks or how teams handle low performance. Recognizing that growth comes from learning and adaptation helps candidates choose answers that emphasize improvement over blame, aligning with Agile's philosophy of continuous progress. Psychological safety is the condition that makes transparency and growth mindset possible. It describes a team climate where individuals feel safe to voice ideas, raise risks, and admit mistakes without fear of ridicule or punishment. Psychological safety is not about lowering standards, but about creating space for honest inspection and adaptation. Without it, teams hide problems, avoid feedback, and stagnate. A classic example is a team member who notices a flaw but stays silent, fearing blame. In a psychologically safe environment, that same individual speaks up, enabling the group to address the issue early. On the exam, psychological safety often appears in leadership or team dynamic scenarios, where the correct action is to encourage openness and remove fear. Candidates who understand this concept recognize its role in enabling high-performing adaptive teams. Kaizen, a Japanese term meaning continuous improvement, embodies the idea that small, incremental changes accumulate into meaningful progress. Rather than waiting for sweeping reforms, teams look for ways to refine practices regularly. For instance, a team might shorten stand-ups by a few minutes, adjust backlog refinement techniques, or improve code review practices incrementally. Each small change may seem minor, but over time they create significant gains in flow, quality, and morale. Kaizen aligns closely with retrospectives, where teams identify opportunities for improvement and commit to trying them in the next cycle. On the exam, Kaizen often underpins questions about process tweaks or leadership choices. Recognizing continuous improvement as a guiding principle helps candidates see why the best answer is often not a dramatic overhaul, but a thoughtful, incremental step forward. Respect for people is another cornerstone of Agile practice. It emphasizes autonomy, mastery, and purpose, recognizing that motivated individuals are the foundation of effective teams. Respect means trusting people to make decisions within clear boundaries, valuing their contributions, and supporting sustainable pace. For example, Overloading teams with unrealistic demands undermines respect and leads to burnout. Conversely, allowing teams to manage their own commitments shows trust and fosters engagement. Respect also extends to stakeholders, whose needs and constraints must be acknowledged. On the exam, respect for people may appear in questions about leadership choices, workload management, or stakeholder interactions. The correct answers usually reflect empathy, fairness, and empowerment. By understanding respect as a principle, candidates can navigate scenarios where tension arises between short-term output and long-term human sustainability. Hypothesis-driven learning introduces a scientific mindset into agile practice. Teams frame assumptions as hypotheses, define success criteria, and run experiments to test them. For example, a team might hypothesize that adding a new onboarding feature will reduce churn by 10%. They release a minimal version, collect data, and evaluate outcomes. If the hypothesis is validated, they expand. If not, they pivot. This approach aligns Agile with lean startup principles, emphasizing validated learning over guesswork. On the exam, hypothesis-driven learning may appear in product scenarios, asking how to evaluate whether a feature delivers value. Candidates who understand this concept recognize that Agile is not just about delivering increments, but about discovering what truly works. Framing work as experiments helps teams reduce risk and maximize value. Time boxing is a constraint that limits work duration, creating focus and encouraging prioritization. By fixing time, teams are forced to make trade-offs, ensuring that something of value is delivered rather than pursuing perfection endlessly. Examples include sprints, daily stand-ups, and retrospectives, all of which are time-boxed. Time boxing also promotes frequent feedback by ensuring that work is exposed regularly. Without time limits, work expands indefinitely, and feedback arrives too late to matter. On the exam, time boxing appears in questions about planning, cadence, or pacing. Candidates must recognize why limiting time is often more effective than expanding scope or resources. The principle reflects a fundamental truth of agility. Constraints foster creativity and discipline, enabling steady progress in complex, uncertain environments. Iterative development builds on time boxing, emphasizing cycles of repetition that refine understanding and solutions. Each iteration delivers a version of the product that is inspected, adapted, and improved in the next cycle. For example, a team might release a simple version of a reporting dashboard, gather feedback, and enhance it in subsequent sprints. Iteration reduces risk by spreading learning over time and allows teams to respond to evolving needs. On the exam, iterative development often underpins scenarios where candidates must choose between delivering a full solution later or smaller versions sooner. The correct approach usually favors iteration, as it provides value earlier and creates opportunities for feedback. Understanding iteration means recognizing that progress is not linear but cyclical, with each cycle bringing the product closer to what stakeholders truly need. Incremental delivery complements iteration by focusing on releasing thin slices of value. While iteration is about cycles of improvement, increments are about tangible outcomes delivered along the way. For instance, rather than waiting months to release a complete product, a team delivers a functional slice that validates assumptions and provides immediate benefit. Incremental delivery reduces risk, builds trust with stakeholders, and provides evidence of progress. It also supports empirical learning, as each increment generates feedback that informs future choices. On the exam, incremental delivery appears in questions about prioritization, stakeholder engagement, or risk reduction. Candidates must recognize why delivering smaller, valuable increments is preferable to holding work until a grand release. This principle embodies Agile's focus on value, reinforcing that success is measured not by effort but by outcomes delivered. For more cyber-related content and books, please check out cyberauthor.me. Also, there are other prepcasts on cybersecurity and more at baremetalcyber.com. Servant leadership is one of the most important concepts in Agile, reshaping how authority and responsibility are expressed. Instead of commanding from above, a servant leader prioritizes enabling others, removing impediments, and nurturing purpose. This style of leadership recognizes that teams are most effective when they are supported rather than controlled. A servant leader clears obstacles, protects the team from unnecessary pressure, and ensures that resources are available. For example, when a team struggles with cross-departmental bottlenecks, a servant leader works to resolve those barriers rather than assigning blame. On the exam, servant leadership often appears in questions about team dynamics, stakeholder pressures, or conflict resolution. The best answers typically involve empowering teams, sustaining culture, and modeling humility. By embracing servant leadership, practitioners embody Agile's respect for people while ensuring delivery remains focused on value. Facilitation is another core leadership skill that ensures productive group interactions. It is the ability to guide conversations and decision-making processes without dominating or prescribing outcomes. A facilitator structures discussions, clarifies objectives, and creates an environment where all voices are heard. In practice, this may mean designing an agenda for backlog refinement that keeps the team focused and inclusive. The role requires neutrality. Facilitators must resist imposing their own solutions while encouraging participants to co-create answers. On the exam, facilitation often underpins scenarios where teams are stuck in conflict, distracted by tangents, or unable to converge on priorities. Recognizing that effective facilitation is about process rather than content helps candidates identify options that encourage participation and focus. Like Agile ceremonies themselves, facilitation provides rhythm and structure that transforms scattered dialogue into purposeful progress. The coaching stance represents a growth-oriented approach to leadership, focusing on inquiry and discovery rather than prescription. A coach asks powerful questions that help individuals and teams explore their options, reflect on experiences, and uncover solutions themselves. For example, instead of telling a team how to resolve a velocity decline, a coach might ask, "What patterns do you notice in your work that could be affecting flow?" This encourages reflection and self-discovery, building ownership of the solution. Coaching differs from teaching or directing because it emphasizes the learner's growth rather than the leader's expertise. On the exam, coaching scenarios often involve leaders deciding whether to step in with direct answers or to encourage exploration. The correct responses typically lean toward empowerment, highlighting that long-term capability is built when people are guided to their own insights. Mentoring complements coaching, but takes a different approach. While coaching emphasizes discovery, mentoring relies on sharing experiences, patterns, and advice to accelerate learning. A mentor draws from their own history to guide others, often providing stories and examples of how challenges were overcome. For instance, an experienced practitioner might mentor a new product owner by explaining how they handled conflicting stakeholder demands. Mentoring is particularly valuable when teams or individuals are unfamiliar with Agile practices and need grounding in proven approaches. On the exam, mentoring appears in questions where candidates must decide how best to support someone developing new skills. Recognizing when to mentor and when to coach is critical. Sometimes people need space to find their own way, while at other times they benefit from direct knowledge transfer. Effective leaders balance both stances according to context. Empowerment and autonomy are essential to Agile teams. They involve granting decision-making authority within clear boundaries, so that individuals and groups can act with ownership. Empowered teams move faster, feel more accountable, and deliver with greater motivation. For example, a team with autonomy over how to structure daily work will often find more efficient solutions than one that is micromanaged. Autonomy must be paired with accountability, ensuring that freedom does not slip into chaos. On the exam, empowerment often surfaces in scenarios where leaders must decide whether to dictate an action or trust the team to decide. The Agile answer usually favors autonomy, provided that boundaries and outcomes are clear. Empowerment reinforces the principle that motivated individuals, given trust and support, are the strongest drivers of sustainable delivery. Delegation and decision rights are closely related, providing clarity on who decides what and when. Without explicit agreements, teams waste energy in confusion or rework. Delegation can be dynamic, shifting as team maturity grows or as tasks change in complexity. For example, a new team may need direction in prioritizing backlog items, while a mature team can handle those decisions autonomously. Decision rights also extend to stakeholders, clarifying when product owners, sponsors, or customers hold authority. On the exam, delegation often appears in questions about how to reduce ambiguity or resolve conflicting expectations. Candidates who understand that clear decision rights reduce friction and improve flow will recognize answers that favor explicit agreements over assumptions. Agile thrives on collaboration, but collaboration requires clarity about who holds responsibility at critical moments. Situational leadership emphasizes adapting leadership style to the maturity of the team and the complexity of the task. Leaders may need to direct when a team is inexperienced, coach as they develop skills, support when confidence builds, and delegate when maturity is high. For example, a leader might provide step-by-step guidance for a new team implementing its first sprint, but later step back and let the team self-organize. The flexibility of situational leadership prevents stagnation and ensures that guidance is always appropriate. On the exam, situational leadership appears in questions where the team's readiness is a factor. Candidates who understand this model will select answers that adjust style to context, rather than applying a one-size-fits-all approach. Agile leadership is dynamic, responsive, and attentive to team development. Influence without authority is a reality for many Agile practitioners, particularly coaches, facilitators, or team members without formal power. Success often depends on persuading stakeholders or peers by framing value, aligning incentives, and building trust. For instance, an Agile coach may need to convince a senior manager to allow experimentation by demonstrating how it aligns with organizational goals. This skill is critical because Agile roles often lack hierarchical power, yet still carry responsibility for outcomes. On the exam, influence without authority may appear in scenarios where formal escalation is possible but suboptimal. The correct action typically involves collaboration, persuasion, or alignment rather than confrontation. Recognizing that influence is earned through credibility and framing, not imposed by rank, is key to succeeding in both practice and exam contexts. Collaboration and cohesion describe the glue that binds Agile teams together. Collaboration means more than cooperation. It requires shared goals, mutual accountability, and active participation. Cohesion builds when teams trust each other, establish norms, and support one another during challenges. For example, a team that shares ownership of outcomes will rally around blockers together rather than blaming individuals. These qualities directly affect throughput, as fragmented teams waste energy in conflict or misalignment. On the exam, collaboration often appears in questions about improving performance or resolving bottlenecks. The correct responses usually focus on fostering cohesion, aligning goals, or reinforcing shared responsibility. Agile delivery is a team sport, and collaboration transforms individual efforts into collective success. Candidates who internalize this principle recognize why many exam answers prioritize team health alongside delivery metrics. Conflict resolution is inevitable in Agile settings, where diverse perspectives and rapid change often create tension. Effective resolution involves surfacing interests, separating people from problems, and seeking win-win outcomes where possible. For instance, when developers and stakeholders clash over scope, a resolution process might focus on shared priorities and incremental delivery rather than entrenched positions. Conflict resolution preserves relationships while solving substantive issues, ensuring that disagreements fuel improvement rather than destruction. On the exam, conflict scenarios often ask how a leader should respond to disputes. The Agile approach typically avoids authoritarian decrees, favoring structured dialogue, transparency, and facilitation. Candidates must recognize that healthy conflict, managed well, strengthens teams rather than weakens them, embodying Agile's belief that openness and respect lead to stronger outcomes. Feedback culture normalizes the exchange of observations and suggestions, making feedback timely, routine, and constructive. In such cultures, feedback is not hoarded for annual reviews but delivered continuously, improving both behavior and product quality. For example, a developer might receive feedback on coding practices during a sprint, allowing immediate course correction. A strong feedback culture enhances team health by reducing misunderstandings and reinforcing accountability. On the exam, feedback appears in scenarios about retrospectives, leadership, or performance management. Correct answers usually favor early, specific, and constructive exchanges rather than avoidance or delayed critique. Agile thrives on fast feedback loops, and this principle applies as much to people as to products. A culture that embraces feedback sustains improvement across technical and human dimensions alike. Emotional intelligence, often abbreviated as EQ, enriches Agile leadership by equipping individuals with self-awareness, self-regulation, empathy, and social skill. Leaders with high EQ recognize their emotional triggers, remain composed under stress, and sense the needs of others. For example, a leader who notices a team member's frustration may pause to acknowledge it before pushing forward. Emotional intelligence enables conflict resolution, supports psychological safety, and strengthens trust. On the exam, scenarios involving emotional dynamics often test whether candidates can detect underlying interpersonal issues. The correct answers reflect empathy and composure rather than rigid enforcement of rules. Recognizing that Agile leadership occurs in complex, ambiguous environments, emotional intelligence becomes a critical differentiator. It ensures that values are not only espoused, but embodied in everyday interactions. Shared ownership and accountability transform Agile teams from collections of individuals into cohesive units. Instead of dividing responsibility, teams assume collective accountability for outcomes. This means that when a sprint goal is missed, the team owns the result together rather than blaming individuals. Shared ownership reduces handoffs, strengthens follow-through, and creates resilience. For example, if a task is incomplete, another team member may step in to help, ensuring delivery. On the exam, shared accountability appears in scenarios about delivery failures or workload disputes. The Agile answer usually favors collective solutions over individual punishment. Recognizing this principle helps candidates understand why exam items often reward team-based responses that align with Agile's collaborative ethos. Accountability becomes less about blame and more about shared commitment to delivering value. Stakeholder alignment is the ongoing effort to ensure that vision, goals, and constraints remain clear across all parties. Without alignment, teams risk drift, delivering increments that do not meet real needs. Alignment requires continuous communication, negotiation, and clarification. For example, backlog refinement sessions may focus on aligning priorities with shifting business strategies. The result is shared understanding, reducing surprises, and increasing trust. On the exam, stakeholder alignment often surfaces in scenarios about conflicting priorities or unclear vision. Correct answers typically involve clarifying goals, engaging stakeholders early, or revisiting assumptions. Agile recognizes that success depends not only on team cohesion, but also on synchronization with those who benefit from delivery. Alignment ensures that value realized matches value intended, protecting against wasted effort and missed opportunities. In conclusion, the vocabulary of mindset and leadership forms the lexicon through which Agile teams operate. Servant leadership, facilitation, coaching, and mentoring describe leadership stances, while empowerment, delegation, and situational leadership clarify how authority is exercised. Influence without authority, collaboration, and conflict resolution highlight the interpersonal skills that sustain team health, while feedback culture, emotional intelligence, and psychological safety describe the environment that enables growth. Shared ownership and stakeholder alignment reinforce that value is delivered through collective responsibility and external engagement. By mastering these terms, candidates not only prepare for exam scenarios but also internalize the language of agile practice. Shared definitions create consistent behavior and reasoning, ensuring that teams act cohesively even in complex situations. The lexicon is more than vocabulary. It is the foundation of agile professionalism. Thanks for tuning in to the Bare Metal Cyber Prepcast, your trusted source for cybersecurity news and insights. Remember to subscribe at baremetalcyber.com so you never miss an update. And visit cyberauthor.me for best-selling cybersecurity books that equip you with expert knowledge. Until next time, stay secure and stay vigilant.